Not all African Americans came from Africa. That is one of the greatest fallacies that has.
What if I told you that nearly 98% of African Americans can actually trace their lineage back to Native American communities? This startling fact challenges everything you've been told about Black heritage in America. Stick around as we uncover the hidden truths behind your ancestry and reveal what has been deliberately concealed from you. Long before Christopher Columbus arrived in 1492, millions of Native Americans, often referred to as Indians, lived in the Americas. However, after his arrival, it is evident that they slowly began to disappear. So, what really happened? This might shock you. Native Americans were taken as slaves and sold to European and African traders. Instead of the commonly known story of Africans being brought to America, some Native Americans were actually shipped from America to Europe and then sent to Africa. These Native American slaves were often wrongly labeled as African, and their true history was overlooked. Native Americans were also forced into labor by European settlers in North America, working on plantations, in mines, and in the building trade. Many were sent to European and Caribbean colonies. For example, records from South Carolina, founded in 1670, show that at least 50,000 Native Americans were shipped to the Caribbean between 1650 and 1730, though the true number might be higher since some shipments were hidden to avoid taxes. This slave trade devastated Native American communities, especially in the southern coastal areas. By 1704, colonial laws forced Native Americans to fight in wars, further entangling them in the colonists' control. The fur trade in the Northeast and the plantation system in the South had massive impacts, forcing many Native Americans to move south. Some who sought refuge in Spanish mission towns were pursued and recaptured as slaves by plantation owners. This often overlooked part of history shows how deeply Native Americans were affected by the colonization and slave trade, long before the American Revolution. The slave trade was a tool used by European powers to control and manipulate both politics and the economy in the Americas. In exchange for alliances and peaceful relations, European settlers often negotiated the release of slaves. For example, in Georgia, the British worked with the Chickasaw tribe, who sold slaves to the English to reduce the native population and prevent the French from arming them. The British saw this as a way to civilize the Native Americans, a stark contrast to the beliefs of French missionaries. Slavery in Native American territories began in Spanish New Mexico and spread as far north as the Great Lakes. Every tribe in this vast area was involved in the slave trade, either as traders or as victims. This practice was a key strategy for European settlers to clear indigenous lands for colonization. Following the Pequot War in 1636, many surviving Pequot were enslaved and sent to Bermuda. Major ports like New Orleans, Mobile, Boston, and Salem became hubs for the slave trade, with Indian slaves shipped to Barbados, Martinique, and other Caribbean islands. Some were even sent to the Bahamas, known as breaking grounds, before being transported to Antigua or New York. Indian slaves faced harsh conditions. Those who weren't taken far from their homelands often escaped to nearby tribes. However, many perished from European diseases and the brutal transatlantic voyages. By 1676, Barbados banned the indentured servitude of Indians, citing their rebellious nature. So, how does this connect to the ancestry of African Americans? By the late 1700s, as the African slave trade grew, Native American women began marrying African men, leading to mixed-race descendants. Over time, the Native American heritage of these individuals became less visible. Changes in public records and bureaucratic practices erased their native roots, often classifying them as colored. In places like Virginia, birth and death records were altered, and census takers mislabeled people of mixed race as black, not Indian. This historical manipulation contributed to the erasure of Native American identity among African Americans, a critical but often overlooked chapter in history. Today, There is a Native American population, especially in the Northeast, that is often overlooked. Interestingly, there is growing evidence suggesting that many modern-day Black Americans share roots with native Black Indians. This connection is seen among groups like the freedmen of the Cherokee and other tribes. In 2015, a historic settlement awarded nearly $1 billion to 645 Native American tribes. The U.S. government feared that more people, often labeled as colored or Black on birth certificates, might discover their Native ancestry. To avoid this, the government quietly set a deadline of December 31, 2014, for claims to land and identity. Even after the deadline, many Native Americans continued to seek settlements through the courts. So where did these native Black Indians come from? Historian Dr. David Motep suggests that all human ancestry, including that of Americans, traces back to Africa. His work challenges the typical narrative of American history, which often starts with cowboys and Indians, by highlighting the African presence in pre-Columbian America. Historian Ivan van Sertima, in his book They Came Before Columbus, presents evidence of Africans reaching the Americas before Columbus. He points to the advanced navigation skills of ancient Africans, cultural similarities with Native Americans, and the exchange of plants, animals, and textiles as signs of early contact. He also mentions documented voyages, like the 1310 Malian expedition, showcasing the seafaring capabilities of African civilizations. Dr. Motep expands on this in his book The First Americans Were Africans, using genetic studies, artifacts, and geological evidence to support the presence of Africans in the Americas long before European explorers. One notable example is a photograph from the HMS Challenger expedition, showing African explorers in South America, which further supports his claims. This history shows that Black Americans have a rich, diverse identity. Many blend their African and Native heritage, challenging the rigid racial categories often imposed by society. Despite historical oppression, Black and Native peoples have built communities, resisted injustices, and created enduring movements for freedom. Have you always wondered where your Black ancestors truly come from? The ancestry of Black Americans is often seen as a mystery, with many stories and theories surrounding their origins. Some believe that all Black Americans are descendants of Africans who were brought to the Americas during the transatlantic slave trade. Others suggest that Black Americans are a mix of African slaves and Native Americans, who lived in the Americas before European colonization. One popular theory is that most Black Americans have African ancestry. DNA studies support this, showing that about 55% of Black Americans have African roots. This connection is a reminder of the shared history of the transatlantic slave trade, a tragic period when millions of Africans were forcibly brought to the Americas. Despite the hardships, Black Americans have kept their African heritage alive through language, music, dance, spirituality, and food. Another theory suggests that some Black Americans have roots in Native American tribes. Family stories and genetic research sometimes reveal connections to indigenous peoples. Historical records, such as marriage licenses and land deeds, also document interactions between Native Americans and African slaves or freed individuals. Black Americans have diverse and complex ancestry, with several theories about their origins. The Hebrew Israelite ancestry. Some Black Americans believe they are descendants of the Hebrew Israelites, an ancient group mentioned in the Bible. Historical records and oral traditions suggest that Israelites migrated to Africa and eventually to the Americas. Genetic tests and shared cultural practices, like observing biblical holidays and dietary laws, support this connection. European ancestry. Due to the history of slavery and forced relationships, many Black Americans believe they have European ancestry. The legacy of these unions is evident in stories of lighter-skinned relatives and genealogical studies that trace some family lines back to Europe. Caribbean and Latin American ancestry. The transatlantic slave trade spread African people across the Americas, including the Caribbean and Latin America. Countries like Jamaica and Haiti became cultural melting pots, blending African, European, and indigenous influences. Some Black Americans trace their roots back to these regions. Pre-Columbian African Presence. A lesser-known theory suggests that Africans reached the Americas before Columbus. Evidence includes African-like features in ancient American artifacts, genetic markers in indigenous populations, and stories of African explorers like Abubakar II. These cultural and linguistic similarities hint at early African influence in the Americas. Each theory adds to the rich tapestry of Black American history, reflecting a diverse heritage shaped by migration, culture, and resilience. The history of Black Americans is far more complex than many realize. From connections to Native American tribes to the potential pre-Columbian African presence in the Americas, these hidden stories challenge what you've been told all along. If you found this video eye-opening, don't stop here. Hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and follow us for more revelations about our shared history. Let's keep uncovering history together.